Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 11 of our English 3180 online course. This week, we're diving into a bit of the European Enlightenment and thinking about some rhetorical pioneers, introducing some ideas that had not yet been quite popularized in discourse. So we've got a lot to go through in our mini lecture where we're going to be looking at Hume and Wollstonecraft and a few of the secondary sources that we looked at this week. Also in this video, I want to give you guys your chat check-in number 11 prompt. And I also want to talk a little bit about your semester-long project. So it's been a couple of weeks now since you guys did your brainstorming presentation, and those, I have to say, were so much fun for me to watch and to think about the projects that you guys were envisioning. We're a couple of weeks further down the road, and I want to talk to you guys about where you should be at in terms of the project. So I'm going to spend a little bit of this video looking at our schedule, talking about your project time management, your game plan, if you will. Then I'm going to spend a few minutes going through our mini lecture, and then I'll close out the video with our chat check-in prompt. So without further ado, I'm going to switch over to my screen share and we'll get right to it. Okay, so here we are. We're in our Canvas shell looking at week 11. You can see the readings that we're doing this week, chat check-in, all the assignments down here. I just want to do a quick looking forward and looking backward just to kind of get us oriented to where we are in the semester. So if you count this week, we have 5 more weeks in the semester. We have a couple more weeks where we're going to actually continue to work through readings that I have planned out. Next week, we'll be doing the Belles Lettres and the emergence of composition studies. And then week 13, the highly anticipated Frederick Douglass week. And that's going to close out our time looking at readings, discussing them, writing our reflections, etc. After that, we're really going to switch into paper drafting mode. So in week 14, you'll see that I have an assignment here for you guys to turn in just a short proposal. This should be more specific and should include a working annotated bibliography that's really going to help you pull together, congeal, and solidify your ideas about this project in written form. And then I'll be available throughout this week, week 14, for office hour appointments to talk to you about your proposals. So the week after that, week 15, it's our final week. This is solely just for finalizing your drafts and submitting them. We're going to do some peer review here. So these last 2 weeks are really dedicated to actually drafting the paper. Now, here's the thing though. I would never want us to only get started on week 14 doing all of the research. So here we are in week 11, and hopefully I've been giving some gentle nudges, but since we turned in our midterm, I've been gently reminding you that you should be starting your secondary research, getting that search on, reading into maybe your top 2 topics that you're thinking about and narrowing it down to like deciding, okay, I'm seeing really compelling sources here and kind of picking. At this point, week 11, I really encourage you to finalize your decision, if you haven't yet, on what is the actual single topic for your paper. And if you have already decided that, continue finding sources, and this week, start your annotated bibliography if you haven't yet. If you have, fantastic, keep adding to it. If you have not started your annotated bibliography yet, this is the week to do it. Pop open a document on your computer. If you've already found a few sources, great, refresh on those, put your citation, write a quick summary with a meal plan structure. And if you don't want to know what a meal plan structure is, I'll try to post a little note here in this video, but it stands for the main point of the article. Any evidence that is key to understanding that article, any analysis that you have about the importance of anything within the article, and linking that whole source to your research topic. So when you're doing your annotated bibliography, you want to make sure that you've got your full MLA style end text citation and a meal plan paragraph that goes over main point, evidence, analysis, and links it back to what you're going to say. And so if you haven't started that already, please start your annotated bibliographies this week. They don't have to be done, right? They're not going to be due until week 14, but start them now and work on them a little bit at a time. And then it won't be so overwhelming when you get to week 13 and you're like, oh crap, I need to write my proposal. So that's my gentle, maybe more clear than I have been to this point, but get started now if you haven't gotten started already. If you have, fabulous, keep going. Okay, so thinking about where we are, where we're going, we're going to take a second now to shift gears, look at our mini lecture, and then we will close out this video with your chat check-in. So I'm going to switch over to my PowerPoint view, and we'll get into that mini lecture. All right, European Enlightenment. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about David Hume and just kind of touch on what he brings to not all of philosophy, because we don't have enough time for that, but specifically, what does Hume contribute to rhetorical theory? So his essay of the Standard of Taste is pretty groundbreaking. It's a seminal piece because he is one of the first people to clearly assert that there is a relativity to aesthetics. Specifically, that people like different things for different reasons. Right, so this quote here, the sentiments of men often differ with regard to beauty and deformity of all kinds, even when their general discourse is the same. So he's not talking about different cultures prioritizing things differently, but folks of the same location and culture differing in what they like. Particularly, he's referring to literature, but he does sort of reverse engineer this out, saying that what's true for literature applies to all of the finer arts. So Hume is basically working off of this assumption that what is good or what counts as beauty is the same or synonymous with how the audience responds to it. So positive human response is what makes something good. And this, again, gets critiqued and reworked, especially when we get further into post-structuralism and postmodern theories about art. Right? Postmodern art does not necessarily need your response to be positive in order for that art to be considered a success. But here, Hume says, if something is good, it's because we have a good, positive response to it. So then, if everything's relative, if there is no objective standard for aesthetics, what then is the standard of taste? Well, Hume doesn't really furnish us with any single response here. Basically, he just kind of sets up lists of comparisons or adjectives, right? So delicacy of taste when it comes to literature is preferred over crudeness. And education is required to create more delicacy. But what that delicacy looks like isn't told to us in very great detail. But we are told very systematically the obstacles to taste. He says, oh, taste can be achieved, but there will be obstacles. Lack of delicacy is one of them. Lack of practice in honing your taste in terms of literature. General prejudice, and here he's referring to just deciding that you don't like something. Like deciding, oh, I don't like Victor Hugo because I don't like French authors, right? That would be an example of prejudice, according to Hume. personal disposition. So maybe he gives the example, some people just don't get irony. Or differences in morality, which, he allows for, that you're not going to have a positive response to something if it affronts your sense of right and wrong. And we see this acted out and reiterated in many, many different ways, from before Hume's time to much longer after. So the main takeaway here, though, is that Hume is presenting a relativity that he's impressing upon aesthetics, that contrary to some of the ancient Greek philosophers that Hume himself so admires, there actually is no objective way to judge the goodness or the beauty of a piece of work. It's all about the response. Then we come to Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is a seminal piece. It's very long. I only had you guys read the first chapter, in which Wollstonecraft outlines some of her initial ideas and questions. This is often seen as one of the earliest works of feminist philosophy, even though none of the traditional terms that are used in feminist philosophy show up in this work. For example, equality isn't a term that really kind of came into being until after Mary Wollstonecraft died. But she is making an argument. She's actually responding to a French philosopher who, at the time, was arguing that women should be only educated domestically because, that really there's no point in giving a woman a quote-unquote rational education. And she's writing this sort of vehement response saying that's actually not the case. In fact, we'll be better prepared to do all these domestic activities as well as be more capable workers. She says, my main argument is built on this simple principle that if women are not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, for truth must be common to all. So it's interesting because in terms of feminist philosophy, she is not actually making many of the traditional arguments that we equate with feminist philosophy. So, for example, her whole argument is couched in women being companions to men, not being independent from them. Although Wollstonecraft herself didn't marry until much later in her life and maintained a sense of both economic and sexual independence, which is interesting. But here, Wollstonecraft, she's identifying reason, virtue, and knowledge as the elements that make an individual distinguished or virtuous. So if men want virtuous wives, then they should give women access to reason, virtue, and knowledge. And she does critique sort of like the triumvirate problems of her time, the heredity, sort of like, oh yes, you come from a good family, a good name, riches, and monarchy. So these are inequalities that she sees as creating conditions wherein even men must act foolishly. And this is something that Rousseau, whom she is arguing against here in this chapter, sees very points that Wollstonecraft pulls up. And so he argues, well, fuck it. Everyone should just, run away from society and become solitary. And she is arguing against Rousseau because she picks apart his argument saying that his idea about a state of nature, which he was rather taken with, this idea sort of like the noble savage, savage being a term derogatorily used about indigenous peoples. So he, thinks this is very romantic and we just need to go and live in solitary nature communing ways because we need to get as close to the state of nature as the indigenous or the savage person. And Wollstonecraft actually, interestingly, argues against this on the basis of theology. So she says this is an affront to an idea that all people are equal in dignity and worth because of a theological principle called Imago Dei, which is that all humans are made in the image of God, and therefore each individual, whether or not they live in certain parts of the globe or have access to certain aspects of culture, every human has intrinsic dignity and worth because of this theological concept. And that's the concept Wollstonecraft uses to argue against Rousseau's use of this state of nature that needs to be pursued. She says everyone already has this worth because of Imago Dei. So, moving on, because there's more there's so much more we could talk about, but I need to get through our two secondary sources. So we have this article by Botting, and she is arguing basically some things that I think are intuitive to any postmodern reader who looks at Wollstonecraft, right? So you probably have already noticed this if you've looked at Wollstonecraft yourself. She argues Wollstonecraft sets up this rhetorical model for women's rights arguments that come after her. Now, she's not trying to argue that Wollstonecraft is the most important sort of proto-feminist writer. She's not even trying to say that, she was the most prolific, because she wasn't. Her life was cut incredibly short. But some key rhetorical moves that Wollstonecraft uses become perpetuated, right? And so Botting's point here is that she's going to show how some key elements, especially Wollstonecraft's use of first person, is an incredibly important rhetorical move that becomes reiterated throughout at least the first wave of feminism. So this idea of expressing self with humor and irony becomes foundational for, and you've probably heard this term before, right? The personal is political. It's a term that embodies an idea about what can be or should be political. And this sort of can trace its origins, Botting says, back to Wollstonecraft's use of personal pronouns, and especially first-person narrative about her experience as a woman. And to do this, to demonstrate this point, Botting is going to take us through some intros to A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she's going to look at how different first-wave feminists have treated this set of ideas and rhetorical strategies from Wollstonecraft in writing their introductions to her seminal piece. So I just think it's fascinating how Botting takes us through the introductions and the history of each woman who wrote them, and then kind of traces what we can see about Wollstonecraft's influence on these particular feminist writers. And last but not least, we have Hanvelt's piece about Hume, and here Hanvelt is really gonna cut to the quick. He's separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, at least for us, because we're not looking at Hume as a philosopher writ large. We don't have time. We're looking at Hume in terms of what he brings to rhetoric and rhetorical theory, and so I think this article is really helpful at kind of directing our focus. Hanvelt's going to argue that Hume's conception of rhetoric is not just foundational to his philosophy, but he brings not just this relativity in terms of aesthetics, but also a concept of high and low, which we can trace back to Aristotle, and in fact, that is what Hume is doing, Hanvelt argues. So Hanvelt says Hume distinguishes between low rhetorical strategies, which Hume classifies as fanatical, or parts of factions. Factions and fanatics use low rhetoric. It's getting at the emotions, it's using cheap tactics, etc. And high rhetoric, the rhetoric that Hume aspires to and thinks everyone should also aspire to, is accurate, just, and polite. This is a key connection because this politeness is going to reveal, Hanvelt will show, Hume's ideas about ethos and delivery. But it's interesting because Hanvelt will go through and sort of compare and contrast some of Hume's key rhetorical moves with the ancient Greek and Roman rhetoricians that Hume so admires. And we just kind of start to see through Hanvelt's demonstration how Hume takes some of these classical rhetorical concepts and repurposes them for his own philosophical aims. So, lots to talk about. I didn't even get into half of my notes about Wollstonecraft's arguments that are based in sensibility, which is this really fascinating physical phenomenon that was talked about. If you have read any Jane Austen, not just Sense and Sensibility, you'll know that at this time period, there was a lot of talk about nerves, women's nerves and men's nerves, and how if somebody's nerves were more sensitive, those folks were more emotional. It's fascinating stuff. I don't have time to fully get into it, but if you're interested, you should look up Arguments and Rhetoric of Sensibility, because it's pretty fascinating. But for now, I'm just going to close us out. I'm going to pull back to our full view and give you your chat check-in prompt. All right, so chat check-in number 11. You probably already knew this, but our dear friend, Mary Wollstonecraft, is in fact the mother of another famous Mary that I'm sure all English majors know, Mary Shelley. Yes, the author of Frankenstein. So that got me thinking about monster stories. You know, Frankenstein is this quintessential monster story. There's others from that time period, of course, you know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There's others before and after. I was just talking to my dad the other day about John Gardner's book, Grendel. It's sort of the tale of Beowulf, but told from the perspective of Grendel, the monster. It's really great. I love that. Might be, maybe I would say, my favorite monster story. But that's the chat check-in question. What's your favorite monster story and why? Yeah, this might be one to have fun with this week. So grab that, do your chat check-in. Of course, if you have any questions about anything I talked about in this video, from your personal curiosity-led research project to the mini lecture, please feel free to shoot me an email and we can either set up a Zoom appointment to have an office hours chat, or we can chat via email. All right. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I will see you in next week's video. Bye, everybody.